Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about City of Bones by Martha Wells. Okay, so whenever I pick up a Martha Wells book, I know I'm in for an incredibly rich world, full of things that are just ever so slightly outside of the normal tropes of the genre, and this one did not disappoint. Okay, so City of Bones takes place in a post-apocalyptic fantasy world. Like, around 500 years ago, there was this great cataclysm. Nobody is really sure exactly what happened because so much history has been lost, but the ancient mages did something, and like 90% of the world, the known world, was encompassed in this boiling wasteland full of poisonous predators and plants, ghosts, lava pools, and heat. It rarely rains anymore, and so food and water have become an incredibly expensive commodity, and humanity barely survived. One of the last of the ancient mages used the last of their power to create a new race of humanity that would be better suited to living in the waste. They can survive longer without water. They are immune to most poisons. They rarely get sick. They seem to be generally tougher than humans, and have pouches like marsupials to incubate babies in. They're called the Chrismen, or the Chris, and our main character, Kat, or Cat, I'm not sure which, is a Chris. But he lives in one of the human cities on the edges of the waste. He works as a relic dealer, someone who finds, verifies, and sells random detritus of the society that existed before the wastes. He enjoys his work. It fits his intense curiosity for history and his love of danger. Because Chris are not allowed to be citizens in this city, which means he cannot handle minted coins, and if he's caught using minted coins, he will be killed. He is constantly in danger of being forced out of the city, or just downright slaughtered because his bones themselves are valuable, and he is often treated as something feral. One day, Kat is approached by a member of the upper class, asking him to guide them out into the waste to one of the ruins that is situated out there to investigate it. And he suspects this is a trap. Even if they don't intend to kill him, he seriously doubts they will actually pay him the exorbitant amount he has been promised. But frankly, he has debts. He trusts his abilities, and he's honestly a ball of self-destructive tendencies. So he takes the job. And sure enough, as he suspected, more is going on than his employers are willing to admit. So there are a lot of things about this book that I want to talk about. I'm going to try to keep this to 3 main categories: the world and setting, the peoples, and the relationships. But no, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff because I don't want this review to be 7 miles long, and I'm still working through my thoughts on some of it. But also just there's so much going on in this book. Like, there's a very big part of me that really wishes Martha Wells had written more books in this world, just because it feels like there's so much going on. But honestly, this one does feel like a standalone. It feels like the characters and the world have had the arc that they needed to have. Which means this is a great book to jump into if you're looking for a Martha Wells to start on. So first, the world. Like all of the Wells books I've read so far, this is an intensely rich world. As in there's just a lot going on, not as in people have money. They don't have money. There's less stuff that just sort of exists in this one than the others. Like, one of the hallmarks of her books to me is there are these odd, like, weird background things that just exist in the background, providing color to the story. And this one has a lot less of that, which it does, that is one of those things that helps make her worlds feel like there is so much more happening below the surface. But in exchange for losing some of that, instead this book has a much more cohesive feeling to it. Like, in this one, if something is described, it's going to be pertinent to the plot, the themes, or the magic system. And it feels like all the disparate elements here actually do click together in a very clear, this is one picture kind of way. There's a faint hint of Middle Eastern vibes to the entire world building, and like, for example, there are lots of domes. The architecture is described as what I think of as very Middle Eastern and like Upper African, and similarly the outfits. They're wearing veils, they're wearing long robes and mantles. And that fits beautifully with this desert-like wasteland. And also there's just the waste itself. There's this beautiful complexity to the way the waste is described. It's very layered, and yes, if you've read this book, that is a bit of an inside joke. But, like, there's a lot of danger here that is heavily balanced with a weird sort of beauty. One of my favorite scenes in this book, and a scene that I know will stick with me for years. It's going to pop into my head at random moments. There's a character who, after a long time not getting to see anything like this, gets to see a sunset over the waste. And it's beautiful and sort of horrifying and sad and all the feels at the same time. And it's just in the description of the setting. It is so well done. My only real complaint about the waste is that it feels like we got really heavy warning about how dangerous the waste was when we first saw it in, like, the first third of the book. Like, we spend a lot of time seeing all these dangers. And then we go back to the waste in the last third of the book, and we don't really see any of them. And I mean, it would have been weird and, like, a little bit out of sync with the narration for them to pop up in those moments because other stuff is happening, but it just ended up feeling a little bit inconsistent. The other big bit of world building here leads me right into my next topic. The peoples. The Kriss. I made a short about this, but, like, fantasy races are probably one of the biggest tropes in fantasy. Like, featuring something that is vaguely human-shaped, acts relatively human, thinks pretty human, but has abilities, physical traits, and longevity that does not match humanity, is one of the things that really defines a book as fantasy. But it's actually relatively narrow what we see in those races. Like, there are certain broad traditional categories that are the norm of what we see. Fantasy books have elves, fairies, dwarves, naiads, halflings, giants, centaurs, shapeshifters, etc. And we may not always call them one of those very traditional names. Like, for example, Lynn Fleming's Night Runner series includes a race called the Awn Fae that are objectively just elves. Like, they are slender, they are elegant, they are magic wielders who live for centuries. They're elves. They're never called elves because that's not what they are in that world, but they fit the general category of elf. And you will occasionally see a race that, like, combines a couple of the more traditional categories. Like, I have not read many of the books following this trend, but there is a current trend for, like, ooh, hot fae guys. And from what I've seen from all these descriptions, it sounds like they're combining traditional fairies and traditional fantasy elves. And I will point out, I'm talking about the fantasy races, not talking about real-world mythology, because that is an entirely different kettle of fish. But the important thing is, we tend to fit in these broad categories. And once in a blue moon, you will find, like, one race that fits outside of those categories. Like, for example, David Weber's War God series features a race called the Haradani? Something like that, I don't know. But they were a super tall, super strong race with fox ears and rage issues. But they're also completely surrounded by the very traditional fantasy races. There are elves in this book, there are dwarves in this book, there are halflings in this book, there are humans in this book. But Wells just sort of says nope to that and does her own damn thing. And honestly, the Kriss are pretty human-looking compared to, for example, the Roxura or any other fantasy race within that book series. But the thing that I find really interesting here is that she specifies the Kriss cannot interbreed with humans, which is rare for fantasy. In fantasy, usually these races can have kids together. Though they are similar enough in appearance that someone has to be pretty damn close to Kot, our main character, to realize he's a Kriss, they are honestly very fetishized, and they are similar enough in anatomy that a human doctor can semi-successfully treat Kot when he's injured, but there are no half-Kriss. Like, no babies are born between Kriss and humans. Like, it's actually a point in the book. And Wells is making a point here that they are a different species, not a different race. They have a different center of balance, they have a different family structure. Admittedly, we only spend time with that one Kriss, Kot. Like, we see some others, but we don't spend time with them. But there is something faintly other about his reactions to people and things. And the Kriss don't fit any of the broad categories of fantasy races. It makes for just a hair more of a divide between him and the people around him, and him and the reader. He is other. And the way Wells plays with his status as other is very nuanced and really interesting. And there's something really interesting going on with the other main way that Cott is othered. He is poor. And yet he finds himself thrust into a situation where he is regularly having to work and walk in the same spheres as the rich, privileged, upper-class people in the society. One of the other main characters is Ellen, and she is on the other side of this divide. She is wealthy, she is privileged, she is born to the upper class, and she is constantly confused with why Cott is nervous around the rich, around the basically magic cops, and around people who clearly see him as less than human. And he doesn't hate her. He often doesn't blame her, though sometimes he does, and he also cannot trust or fully rely on her because of this. And it's all so beautifully nuanced and well done. And there is no ham-fisted moment in this book when she suddenly realizes, oh, the world is dangerous for him, I need to be more careful with him. It's just a beautiful buildup of them learning to respect each other as people with this barrier between them, and her very slowly, like very, very slowly, realizing the barrier exists in the first place and realizing what that means. And one of the things I respect most about this book is the fact that the barrier never fully disappears. It's not a matter of, oh, now we're friends, so class doesn't matter, wealth doesn't matter. Slight spoiler here, but this is one of those books that has a broken world that doesn't get magically fixed by the end of the book. The cultural inequality isn't fixed, the lack of resources isn't fixed, our characters have a relatively happy ending, but it acknowledges that you can't wave a magic wand and fix everything wrong with an oppressive, cruel society in one go. And I sort of love that honesty. And that leads me to the relationships. This entire section is going to be just a bit of a spoiler. I'm sorry if you want to skip to the end, I don't blame you. But I was 100% clear from pretty much the beginning that this book was building to a romance between Cott and Ellen. Maybe it's just because fantasy almost always has that side plot romance, and because of that you show me two main characters of roughly the same age bracket, of genders that match each other's preferences, and you just know that there's going to be a romance. When it hadn't really shown up about 3/4 of the way through the book, I was even beginning to wonder if maybe Cott was asexual, which would have been cool, but that's definitely not what's going on here. Like, we see a moment of him feeling sexual attraction. But he might be aromantic. But he definitely does feel sexual attraction. Though, considering when the one moment we get to see him showing a lot of sexual attraction, considering what's going on in that moment, Ellen may just not be scary enough to match his type. But I actually am even more interested in where this book is going outside of the notion of him just being aromantic. Again, here's the big spoiler. We get to a moment where Ellen acknowledges that she does like Cott, but Cott doesn't share her feelings. He does not see their lives as possibly meshing. He does not really fully trust her, though he tries to soften the blow a little bit by pointing out the fact that he doesn't trust anyone. And he points out that she doesn't fully trust him either. And it's not tragic. It's not an unhappy ending. It's a little bit of a morose moment, but overall it's just okay that we don't get our happy heteronormative embrace at the end. And I love that. They can both have happy endings without romance shoehorned in. And it acknowledges that the breach of trust that is so often worked through in this kind of story sometimes isn't something you can shrug off. And the hilarious thing is that the breach of trust between them is nowhere near as bad as the breach of trust that I usually see in fantasy novels with a third act breakup to drive the leads apart. And they do sort of work through it, but they also acknowledge that once they aren't fighting for their lives, this may be another barrier between them. Basically, this is the rare book that shows us two characters who could be attracted to each other, show at least some signs of actually being attracted to each other, build an emotional attachment to each other, and yet still don't belong together as a couple. And I love that. Like, I am so happy to see a book where we have two people who could be in love and just aren't. And that's fine. It's not that big of a deal. And objectively, this is why I keep buying Martha Wells books and absolutely loving every single one of them. Every single one of the books that I've read of hers has had at least one theme or plot element that is just so unusual. And they sort of creep up on you because so much of how Wells writes feels very traditional fantasy. It's a hair more poetic in the descriptions than a lot of the trash fantasy I read back in the 90s. It's well written, but it doesn't wear its oddity on its sleeve. It's not screaming, I'm an experimental novel, look at the weirdness. And there's always something there that you don't see in other books. And of course, there's always the beautiful character work. Cott is everything I love in a character. He is playful yet aggressive, he's intelligent, he's deeply caring, though at first glance he seems unempathetic. And he has this deeply traumatic backstory, which you want me to like a character, just give them a deeply traumatic backstory. I'm in, I'm good, especially if they seem really cheerful when you first meet them. I'm here for it. But there's also this, he has this really sweet support system of people who care about him and look after him and refuse to let him give in to the worst of his self-destructive tendencies. And like, Ellen is also really great. She has this really lovely self-assurance to her. And the thing is, young female characters who show a lot of surety in themselves, I hate to say it, but they are usually shown to be wrong in novels. Like, there's usually like a moment that they get their feet knocked out of them, they get the pride knocked out of them. And to a certain vague extent this happens, but no, Ellen has rights to be sure of herself. She knows what she's doing. She has numerous skills. She's intelligent, she's brave and persistent. And she does have this deep undercurrent of fear and insecurity, but it's only about one big thing. And that gives her a place for her art to go. Like, that is what her art is about. And also gives us this really interesting basically backdoor entrance into this theme of power sort of being a barrier between people. And it's all really interesting. Like, seriously, there is so much going on in this book. And I'm trying to think of some negatives here because I always like my reviews to be balanced, but the only thing that pops into my head right now that I did not love about this book is that sometimes the descriptions of the settings got just a little bit too much for me. Like, I would get lost in exactly where we were in the scene and, like, the description of, okay, we're climbing a wall, where is this wall? I don't know. But I think that has more to do with my own inability to mentally map out scenes from a book than with any writing problems. I'm sure there are some other people who can find flaws in this book, but right now I'm not seeing them. I am just, right now, enveloped in the joy of I love this book. And I think this one is going to stick with me for a very long time.